We haven't heard about the Lord of the Rings Gollum game in quite some time, though it was announced, I think, almost 2 years ago. As you probably have heard, it was delayed and then it became a bit silent around that game. But just yesterday, a new trailer was released called the Story trailer, and it shows us some little bits of the story, which is quite interesting. And today I want to look into exactly this little trailer and put it into context of what Tolkien wrote in his books and what we might or what we can expect from the story here. My name is Chris, aka ThePhilosophersGames, and I do mostly Tolkien lore content and Lord of the Rings lore content on YouTube, so I would say I'm somewhat of an expert, if you want to call it like that, though there are of course people far more knowledgeable than I am, but I still have a pretty decent knowledge of all the books, including the History of Middle-earth books and so on. So we look into this. Also, I want to give you a little spoiler warning, because this might kind of spoil what is in the game, though I guess you already know how his story might end. On top of that, I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it, which includes some trilled R's. I freestyle this here. English is not my native language, so that is kind of tough at times. But let us start. At the beginning of the trailer, we see Gollum in his cave, I assume, in the Misty Mountains, and we see him doing something very interestingly. He carves something into a stone, and it's a shape of the One Ring that he carves there, his precious. I would assume that this scene is maybe a flashback or the intro sequence, because in a moment he will turn around as if somebody is approaching him or getting close, and that might be when Bilbo meets him during the events of the Hobbit book. That is in the year Third Age, 2941. And just for comparison, Frodo leaves the Shire 3018 in the Third Age, so that is round about 77 years later. So that's a lot of distance, timely distance between these two events, because a lot of things happen in the meantime. And also, there are some story bits Tolkien actually wrote about Gollum, just a very basic outline, but we at least have an idea where he went and at times at least what he did. Very early on in his life, it's very murky, and then later on in his life, it becomes a little bit more fleshed out as we get closer to what is happening in The Lord of the Rings, leading then to the events of The Lord of the Rings. As said, you probably know how his story might end. But most scenes we see here in this trailer, except for this one, play later in his life, so closer to the events of The Lord of the Rings. So I assume we won't see much of his very, very early life, where he's still in the Misty Mountains, in his cave, waiting for Bilbo. And if we look into the timeline of Tolkien, he is in this cave and leaves it at some point to look for the thief of his precious, and that is 2944 in the Third Age. So he is like 3 more years in this cave, and he doesn't like it outside, he doesn't like the sun, he doesn't like the moon, he doesn't even like himself. Like, he has a very complicated, like, it's a very devastated, complicated, corrupted character, and I think it's a very interesting one. And though so far the reception of this game and the basic idea was received quite mixed, it seems, I have to admit, I think it is actually a very interesting story to tell what Gollum did between the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. However, of course, in his life before, we have like a lot of time in this cave, and basically nothing happens, and we know not really much about it. We only know his very early life, where he was still Smeagol or Smeagol, if you pronounce him Old English. And in this case, in this very few notes of Tolkien we have of that time, we just know that he's a Stur hobbit. There was he had a grandmother who was influential in his hobbit Stur tribe, and he found the ring, or let's say his friend Deagle found the One Ring. He killed him. He wanted it as a birthday present, took it for him. Then he did, I don't know, spy on people with the ability to get invisible, and did some kind of evil things with it. I guess the ring had definitely an influence on him, and then he was kicked out at some point by his grandmother, and he was on his own, and then he went into the cave in the Misty Mountains and slowly became the Gollum we know from The Lord of the Rings over hundreds of years. So that is the very early story of him. The story then, when he leaves the Misty Mountains, is a bit murky or complicated at times, and a lot of huge gaps are in it, so it's very difficult to construct a lot. They would have, if they would have want to portray this story in this game as well, they definitely had a lot of blank pages to fill, so I could totally understand why they would maybe focus more on his later life, where there's simply more story bits we know about what is going on, or just actually use the opportunity to fill those blank pages. I think both directions are interesting, though maybe they also try to find a compromise of both of that. I'm not sure. For example, Tolkien writes about what happens when he leaves his cave in the Misty Mountains. That happens, by the way, in the year 2944. And Gandalf explains to Frodo in the following quote what he did at this time. But from hints dropped among the snarls, I gathered that his padding feet had taken him at last to Esgaros, that is, Lake Town, and even to the streets of Dale, listening secretly and peering. Well, the news of the great events went far and wide in Wilderland, and many had heard Bilbo's name and knew where he came from. So if we read the original Hobbit story, Bilbo introduced himself as Mr. Bilbo Baggins, but as far as I'm aware, he did not say that he's from the Shire. So Gollum had to find out where Bilbo's actually from and where he can find the thief of his precious. So he had to find out that he's from the Shire. And in this quote, it is implied that he left his cave in the mentioned year and went east in the direction on basically the path of the Hobbit, of Bilbo and his dwarf companions to the Lonely Mountain. And there he found out, because everybody was still talking about this event, about Bilbo Baggins and Bilbo Baggins from the Shire. And so he knew, Bilbo Baggins, he's from the Shire. And then it becomes, quite a bit complicated to reconstruct his further path. It happens that in the year 2951, that Sauron, the Dark Lord, declares himself openly and gathers power in Mordor. Let me just read here the Appendix B entry from The Lord of the Rings. He begins the rebuilding of Barad-dûr. Gollum turns towards Mordor, and Sauron sends 3 of the Nazgûl to reoccupy Dol Guldur. So here we have a mention of him that Gollum, for whatever reason, turns towards Mordor. And basically, what we can read in some other notes is that Sauron is bending his will to summon all the evil and wicked things in Mordor to get his plans going. And this also influenced Gollum in some way, though he didn't have the One Ring anymore, but Sauron kind of, I assume, unconsciously influenced Gollum to go there as well. And then he went into the direction, interestingly. However, only in the year, 29 years later, so that took some time. It was not like, okay, I got summoned, I just go there. He was potentially searching, doing all kinds of things. The next note we can find about him is in the year 2980. About this time, Gollum reaches the confines of Mordor and becomes acquainted with Shelob. Shelob we also see in the trailer, and we see potentially Gollum fleeing from her and interacting with her. So this part seems also to be in the trailer, which is, in my opinion, quite interesting. So he's at the borders of Mordor and these huge mountain ranges around it, and there he meets Shelob in some way, and that gets acquainted with her. That is how he makes kind of a deal with Shelob later, and we see this story then in The Lord of the Rings with Sam and Frodo playing out. And then the next entry is from the year 3001. Gandalf seeks for news of Gollum and calls the help of Aragorn. So he wants to find Gollum as well, because he might be the missing puzzle piece that he needs to figure out what is going on with the rings of power and so on and so forth. What is, he's kind of worried of all the bad things potentially happening here and there, and he starts searching. However, it doesn't really work out, and I think he also asks, we can find that in another note, the woodland elves in Thranduil's realm to also help him find basically the trace of Gollum, because he has to be walking around there back and forth, and maybe heard about this. It's a bit difficult to tell where Gollum exactly went in this time. And with the help of those, they kind of find at least some hints, but they couldn't never catch Gollum himself. And then Gandalf had other worries and let the thing be, which Gandalf calls one of his biggest mistakes ever. And only in the year 3009, Gandalf and Aragorn renew their hunt for Gollum. But in this year, at some time during these years, Gollum himself ventured into Mordor. I maybe would put in again, so I assume he got acquainted with Shelob and left again, and then I don't know where he ever went to. Maybe he was also all the time in Mordor itself. It's difficult to tell, but at this point he must have left and ventured again into Mordor, and then he was captured by Sauron. And here he was potentially at some point, we don't know when, interrogated and tormented. We can, for example, read some interesting a description of him that he was like licking his fingers, like as if he had like some old wounds of torment there, and so on and so forth. In the year 3017, so 1 year before Frodo leaves the Shire, Gollum is released from Mordor. That's the pretty much last note, or one of the last notes that we have here. And then, interestingly, he is taken by Aragorn in the Dead Marshes. So Aragorn is still hunting for Gollum. He is released from Mordor, and finally he's free, and then he gets captured again by Aragorn, and that is kind of tragic. And brought to Thranduil in Mirkwood, and this is why we see Thranduil here in this particular story. I think just to give you a basic outline of what Gollum's past is and how it might have worked. Why Sauron set Gollum free was like he discovered that there was some kind of evil in Gollum as well, and that he would put, like there was something in him that would lead Gollum to take revenge on those who stole his precious from him. And so, out of malice, Sauron said, that could be useful for me, so I let you free and hunt him. Though Gollum also saw, interestingly, Tolkien writes this in an essay about Gollum and the hunt. It's called Hunt for the Ring, I think it is, published in Unfinished Tales, that also Gollum saw Sauron as like a rival for his One Ring, and also as an enemy. So it was not like he was cooperating freely with Sauron, and Sauron couldn't completely crack Gollum without destroying him. That is also something that is noted, which is kind of impressive, one has said. Even with the immense and powerful fear that Sauron can put into people, Gollum could not be completely corrupted and put under Sauron's will. That is very impressive detail here. So this is a basic outline, and I would like to look into now the trailer, because the trailer does not go through all of this chronologically. As a result, I thought it might be smart to just now go through the trailer chronologically, like how it's played, and then we have the context already of everything here. There's, of course, also, I should mention, next year, 3018, Thranduil is attacked by orcs, and in this attack, Gollum can escape, and then he also escapes the orcs and hides in Moria, but can't get through. Like, he's on his way to Eriador, because he also potentially learned kind of where in the Shire might be, I assume, and he assumes it's in Eriador. So he goes there, and then the story of Gollum is connected again to the Lord of the Rings events. For example, in the films we also see Gollum the first time in the Moria section, so that is where he tries to go like west of the Misty Mountains through Moria. Here we see him noticing something. I assume it's Bilbo, actually. And then we have the Riddles in the Dark story. Here we see the mentioned realm of Thranduil, the Elven King, and that is in Mirkwood, which was previously called Greenwood the Great. And here in the distance we see the Lonely Mountain, that is where Bilbo and his dwarf friends under Thorin Oakenshield go. Gollum is brought here into this realm and kept captive, and Gandalf interrogates him, which is a scene we will see next. We see, like, I assume the voice here in this next scene of Thranduil talking to Gandalf. And here in Mordor we also see, I assume, this tower there in the background could be Barad-dûr, and this here might be Ciris Ungol, but I'm not sure. Very hard to tell. We see, of course, also the Mount Doom in the background. Then here we see Thranduil's realm, and Thranduil talking to Gandalf as mentioned. And here we had a lot of criticism already by some people, I guess, because Gandalf looks very different from what we are used to. Some might definitely disagree with the art style here. Pretty much any art style that is quite different from how we know Gandalf looks from the Peter Jackson films has the potential to be criticized. So there's definitely that. What we know about Gandalf is that he has a blue hat. His hat here is not blue. It's a pointy hat that is kind of correct. He has a staff. That is correct. His robes are grayish. That is also described. What I potentially find unusual is that his beard has like a darker color. Like in the books, he's always described as having like a white beard. So that is definitely unusual here. And Gandalf had like broad shoulders, but wasn't very tall, and he went very bent, like an old man. Thranduil, in contrast, we have also not that many descriptions. In the Hobbit book, we have like an interesting mention of his headwear. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was come again. In spring, he wore a crown of woodland flowers. So, depending on the season, you could say, he had different headwear, I would maybe call it. And this is here an interpretation of that, potentially reflecting the current season. I can see that people might dislike this, but I assume, kind of live with how he's depicted here. I think it was mentioned somewhere that it's kind of golden in The Hobbit. So that is a bit unusual, but it might be the lightning here or so. I think I definitely know the actor playing Thranduil in the Hobbit films is very popular, and Thranduil is very much like character by a lot of people. He should have like Legolas more golden hair, which is also quite unusual because Thranduil is one of the Sindar elves, which usually have, like, I would assume, more dark hair, black hair, something into this direction. This must be at the time that Gollum was already captured and interrogated by Gandalf. And as I just explained a little bit earlier, this was in the year 3017 roundabout. And he also talks about Mordor, which is true. There is definitely something going on in Mordor. And we can also read several interesting notes in the Unfinished Tales. There's a chapter called Hunt for the Ring. Let us continue. Here we see the scene that I mentioned, that Gandalf interrogated him. And he asks him, what have you told the Dark Lord? Gandalf, of course, also mentioned that he had to kind of almost force him to tell something, and he would just always kind of lie, and he has to look through his lies and basically puzzle together what actually happened. That is what he explains to Frodo in the chapter The Shadow of the Past and in the Council of Elrond. And then we see this character here. And if we look close, we see like a red eye on his helmet. So he must be like a servant of Sauron in some shape or form. And we also saw some orcs. Like, I think there is another scene. Here we see the orc next to him. And it seems this is basically the attack on Thranduil's realm, where this guy and the orcs come and capture little Gollum. We can read in, I think also in the Hunt for the Ring chapter, that the wood elves, like the elves of Thranduil, could not find out how Gollum exactly coordinated this, but they assumed that there was some kind of coordination. And in the Council of Elrond, Legolas also explains the story a bit more detailed. There, he explains that and Gandalf also confirms this, that the woodland elves, while Gollum was captured there, were very kind to him and tried to almost cure him from this state that he has and from his madness and corruption, and they treat him very well. They did not want to put him into like their dungeons and so on, because there he would fall back into his dark thoughts again, but let him even walk around and just guarded him. And there was, for example, the story that he was climbing up on a tree, getting back to nature in a way. The woodland elves there were were closer to nature compared to, for example, the other elves like the Noldor or something. But yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting detail, and somehow he must have had some coordination here, because at some point orcs attacked Thranduil and they slew the guards, I assume while he was on one of those trees, and on his tree, and then he went with them for a time. And maybe this is potentially what we see here. Sauron also, we can read that in the Hunt for the Ring, wanted him either dead or alive, if possible, because if he's dead, he can't give more information to the enemy, and so they can't have counsel. And Sauron wanted to act quickly, because his enemies should not have time to have counsel and so on. So that was a very important event at this time. Sauron already interrogated him a long time ago, and in this context, he didn't need like potentially more information of him, but it might have been useful, because Sauron was still also trying to find out where this Shire is exactly. He knew Bilbo Baggins and Shire, but he did not know where it is. And that is the reason for some of the movements of his Nazgul and so on, also described in the Hunt for the Ring essay, which is very interesting, as said. And so he potentially just wanted to have Gollum back, but if he's dead, he wouldn't mind either, so he could not give counsel to the enemy. And I think that is what we might see here. And then we see him we see captivity. I'm not sure how this is connected exactly. Here we see also some dark figures. I assume this is the mouse of Sauron, and the other guy is the person who goes with the orcs and observes what is going on there. So he's also potentially one of the higher up servants of Sauron here in this context. This is potentially earlier, where he's a bit younger, if that makes sense in the context of Gollum. My fear is a bit that they fuse all of this together. So this is how he gets to Mordor and gets interrogated, but this is, as said, wrong. He was already interrogated, and then basically second, he was captured then by Sauron. As said, it's a bit complicated. And here we see also another early event in the year 2980, that was. Here we see like the shadow of Gollum and, of course, Shelob. It's also spoiler warning here, because we will also see Shelob here in a moment, in her glory. There she is. And it seems like he has to escape or has to make a deal with it. Here we see that's what I mean. His hair looks darker again. So I assume we might see very different time spans, and maybe they try to explain this or make this visually more relatable by him aging a little bit or something, and his hair gets grayer or lighter or so. Difficult to tell. But here he sneaks then through Mordor and does all kinds of things. We have seen some other stuff. We also see, like here, one of the Nazgul, potentially the Witch King or so, hard to tell, on one of their so-called winged steeds or fell beasts. There's no official names of these beings. What I kind of like of the design here is the mouth of them looks a bit more like a beak, because in the books they are described as having a beak, so they're looking less like little dragons or something like that. If this is a Witch King, he should wear a crown. He doesn't, so it's potentially not the Witch King, but who knows. And here we see, maybe that's the same Nazgul. We see, I assume, one of the ring race here. If he had ever contact with those is not really known, but I assume he has. How Gollum was captured in Mordor, we also don't know. We just know that in the year 3009, he ventures into Mordor, and then at some point he was captured by Sauron and his servants. What happens after that is very hard to tell. Here we see like some escape scenes again, and here another interesting scene, which I talked earlier. We see Gollum with like an elf, I assume. And as mentioned, the woodland elves really took care of Gollum and were very kind to him. And this ultimately led to his escape. They were probably a bit too kind there, especially in this combination with his orc attack. And I assume this is basically what we see. They try to help him, try to cure him a bit and be friendly to him. And potentially this is a character that portrays this kindness that the elves of the woodland realm gave to Gollum in this particular context. So, as we know that he will escape from Thranduil's realm at some point. And yeah, it's also described in the book that they often set him free and went through the forest, let him climb trees, let him be free, let him feel the wind and so on. So instead of putting him into a dark prison cell where he can fall back to his dark thoughts. So I think this is kind of what we might see here. Here's the same, I guess, from a different perspective. Here we see like a close-up. I can definitely see why the art style is a bit criticized here and there. The eyes look very strange. It's very subjective in a way, and still there is a potential for an interesting story. And I have to admit the backgrounds and so on looked at least somewhat decent for the most part. It's definitely a game by a smaller developer, also from Germany, and there is a term Eurojunk for some of these kinds of games, which often can be quite charming, but maybe a bit problematic and not perfectly on the technical side, and maybe even on the visuals and so on. So we might see like another prime example of this in this game, but I simply hope the story is good. Here we see another interesting scene. I wondered where this might be. Here we might have seen like a story that was potentially portrayed differently a little bit. Here we see the person who also we saw when he was captured, like this man with the orcs, and they look like a portrayal of, I assume, Sauron, and this might be Elendil here, because the sword is still in one and not broken yet, and it's potentially his victory. Maybe this is like the Murdo version of the story, but in the version we know, it's also different than in the Lord of the Rings films, actually, a little bit in some details. For example, there Gil-galad and like that was the High King of the Noldor elves, and Elendil, the father of Isildur, fought against Sauron, and both died in the process. But Sauron himself, in this fight, was overthrown, as it's described as well. So he was also defeated. It was like a double KO, you could say. And then Isildur came and could cut off the ring of Sauron's hand. Now we see some other scenes. Here we see like an elf, again, maybe, I'm not sure if it's a woman or we have seen earlier, I don't think it is. So it's potentially somebody else. And also in a dungeon, I'm not sure if this is in Mordor already, and he has a stone or something in his hand. Very difficult to tell, or if this is also in the dungeons of Thranduil or so. No idea what this potentially has to say. Could also be like another person. And the game also hints at, and we have seen this like in the gameplay trailer, that there's like an evil and a good path. Like you can play him evil and good. It was that very night of summer, yet moonless and starless, that orcs came to us unaware. So that is potentially not the night. The star constellations are very important, and also there's another very powerful spirit being called Varda or Elbareth, a name you often hear in the Lord of the Rings, and she's like revered by the elves quite a bit, and a very important and powerful entity who set the stars into the sky and so on. And of course, the moon is also a very important for the elves. But also, I guess, the sun. Though the sun is more a symbol of men, interestingly, because men awoke at the first sunrise. But kind of interesting to see all these little details here. Here we see like a more higher quality rendering of Gollum's face, so it's potentially a cutscene. He can swim, it seems. And here we see like, yeah, another. It's hard to tell if this is maybe Thranduil and the elven woman we have seen a moment ago, and they follow him. We see some gameplay elements like Gollum climbing potentially here through Thranduil's realm. And yeah, here we have the Shelob scene. He's climbing up and down. Here we also see Gandalf. Potentially that is his interrogation of him to find out the very important details he has to find out. Here, if this is Thranduil, it's hard to tell. Maybe this is Legolas. It would also be interesting to see, because he has golden hair. So that is interesting. It could also be maybe like just another character that is invented also for the story. I assume this, I'm not sure, but this could be the man that we have seen earlier under this mask thing with the eye on his head. Difficult to tell, or it's another character. And here we see Gollum finding a ring, and I assume that is the ring we have seen in that other scene, the ring of the elven woman, and he seems to look at it, and we know Gollum kind of likes rings, so I could imagine that it's connected somehow. And this is an interesting scene as well. Like, we can basically also read that in very, like, there were stories about when Gollum haunted in his very early life, when he was still more like a Stir Hobbit with the One Ring, he became invisible and robbed nests and so on. So this might be referencing this. He potentially broke into houses through windows and went for the cradles and stuff like that. So definitely a very, like, deep inside can be a very, very evil entity or being. So I'm very curious what they will do with this. Here we see Shelob a bit closer. She looks a little bit less spider-like, which is potentially to make, like, he looks more like a Zergling or something like this from StarCraft. Of course, very creepy as well, but potentially to avoid arachnophobia. So here we see like a little different design for the, let's call them winged steeds or fell beasts or whatever. Like I said, they don't have an official name, and the Nazgul. And then the trailer is already over, and it just says the game comes out 2023, and that is basically what we see in it. There's no release date yet, but I assume they will announce it soon. I assume their problem might be that releasing games in 2023 is very difficult, because this year is insanely stacked. If I were in marketing and the game was at least realistically to be ready at that point, I would maybe focus on something like July, because that's one of the few months where not, I don't know, two, three very, very big blockbuster games are coming out that basically ban you into the shadow of forgetfulness, because some of those games like The Legend of Zelda is coming out in June, Diablo 4, Street Fighter. Besides those, there's Jedi Survivor, Resident Evil 4 is coming out at the end of March this month, and so on. So I don't see that the game, they might move it to the second half of 2023, because there are not many games announced yet. In September, Starfield comes out. We just got the release date there. So I'm looking forward for this game, and all there is then left to say is thank you for watching. I hope, as said, that you enjoyed this video. If so, maybe press the like button. Maybe leave me a comment and tell me what you think about the game. Maybe how you like the art style, the aesthetic, the visuals of the game. If you're kind of interested in the story of Gollum, or if you think the story of Gollum is already told, there's no need for more, and so on. So I would appreciate that much. And if you like Tolkien content, then or want to be updated on this game when there are any bigger or more interesting news, then feel free to subscribe and, of course, press the annoying bell. Next on this channel here, as said, there will be a live stream where I do like my classical lore, Tolkien lore Q&A stuff and answer lore questions and so on. Not sure when, potentially Sunday or so. I also currently working on the Who is Elrond part 10 video. That will come up on the channel. If you like more gaming content, there's also like a little gaming channel I have, where I recently gave my first impressions of the Kerbal Space Program 2 early access. The Gollum stuff here will be, or the Lord of the Rings gaming stuff will be on the main channel. All other gaming stuff will be there. And then I also at times stream on Twitch. Currently, I'm at the very end of finishing my Rune Level 1 challenge run of Elden Ring. We're at the final boss right now. And after that, we might try the Resident Evil 4 demo and continue maybe later with Satisfactory, which I also started playing. And then already some very interesting games come out. I also want to check the Volong beta there. There's also Discord, there's Twitter, I don't know, follow me there if you like Lord of the Rings stuff and gaming stuff and so on. Shoutouts to all my supporters who support me here, for all the likes, comments, and friendly messages I always receive. That's much, much appreciated. I wish you all a fantastic rest of the day. Again, thank you for watching, and goodbye.